the story of a hero in our country's darkest hour, who lit the lamp of liberty by speaking truth to power. Julian was the journalist, known both far and wide, in command of WikiLeaks and
I'm Vincent DiStefano. I'm the National Organizing Director for Assange Defense. And today we'll be discussing a very sad anniversary with our esteemed panelists, the 5th year of the imprisonment of Julian Assange in Belmarsh prison. Julian has been incarcerated in the British equivalent of Guantanamo, that moral stain on the soul of the United States, as of today, for 5 years. He goes on to his 6th. This, after 7 years of confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy, where he sought asylum to avoid extradition to U.S. to stand trial for telling the world the truth about American war crimes, which the U.S. wished to hide and never see the light of day. Although we are here to recognize this painful anniversary, it is all the sadder because Julian to date has been convicted of nothing. We are seeing in real time a reversal, a kind of justice that the United States has prided itself and has held up to the rest of the world as an exemplar. That reversal is incarceration first and then trial and conviction later. To discuss this and more, I would like to introduce our panelists. First, my dear friend, Stefania Marizzi, an Italian investigative journalist working for a major Italian daily, Il Fatto Quotidiano, after 14 years for Republican Express, from which she resigned in 2020 in order to continue her work alongside WikiLeaks. Among international journalists, she is the only one who worked on all the WikiLeaks secret documents since 2009, with a few exceptions for database documents. She is also the only one who's engaged in trench warfare to unearth the truth on Julian and WikiLeaks through freedom of information request litigation in the US, UK, and Australia, and Sweden since 2015. She recently published a book on her 15-year-long investigative work on WikiLeaks revelations and on the case, Secret Power, WikiLeaks and Its Enemies. By the way, I have read this book twice, and I could not recommend it any higher if you wish a tutorial on this Kafkaesque case, and not only that, how WikiLeaks works. All right. With a foreword by renowned director Ken Loach, published by Pluto Press. This book has won 3 major journalistic awards, including the European Award for Investigative Judicial Journalism, and is now available in English, Italian, French, and Spanish, and soon German. Stefania refused a nomination for the 4th awards to her book on WikiLeaks because of ethical reasons, as the main sponsor of the award was a major bank profiteering from arms export. This is one thing that all of our panelists have in common. They stand on principle. The next person I'd like to introduce really needs no introduction. That is the world-famous journalist Chris Hedges, who spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent in Central America, Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He was an early outspoken critic of the U.S. plans to invade and occupy Iraq, and has been proved prescient in that, and called the press coverage at the time shameful cheerleading, which it most certainly was. In 2002, he was part of a team of reporters for the New York Times who won a Pulitzer Prize for the paper's coverage of global terrorism. The same year, he won an Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. Chris is the author of the 2000 seller, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which I too keep, like Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, on my bedside, and I read constantly. To be depressed and to be enlightened. He said, I've seen too much violent death. I've tasted too much of my own fear. I have a painful memories that lie buried and untouched. Most of the time, it is never easy to when they surface. Some contend that his book, Collateral Damage, is the most courageous work that he has written. For it, he interviewed combat veterans of the Iraq War, have testified on the record about atrocities carried about American soldiers and Marines during the military occupation of Iraq. His book reveals in heartbreaking detail the devastating moral and physical consequences of the occupation for all parties. He's published the following books: What Every Person Should Know About War, Losing Moses in the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America, American Fascists, The Christian Right, and the War on America. I Don't Believe in Atheists. Empire of Illusions, The End of Literacy, Triumph of Spectacle in the Days of Destruction. He is truly one of a kind. Next is Abby Martin, an American journalist, TV presenter, and filmmaker. She founded the Citizen Journalism Media Roots, investigative journalism documentary and interview series, The Empire Files, which again, I highly recommend. Abby has directed several films, including Gaza Fights for Freedom and the forthcoming documentary, Earth's Greatest Enemy. Abby has also contributed to several books, including Guilty of Journalism, Political Case Against Julian Assange by our good friend Kevin Gostala, and has been covering Assange for the last 15 years, among many other things. Chip Gibbons, my dear friend Chip Gibbons, is the policy director of Defending Rights and Dissent. In that capacity, he has advised members of Congress on reforming the Espionage Act and been working to educate Congress about the press freedom implications of the Assange extradition. Chip is also a journalist and researcher and focuses on the abuse of U.S. security state at home and abroad. He's written extensively about the abuses of the Espionage Act and has covered the U.S. Espionage Act prosecutions and drone whistleblower Daniel Hale and Julian Assange for Jacobin. Now, he has a new piece coming out today in The Nation. I will mention more of this when we wrap up at the end, but I would suggest you all go online and read this excellent article. That would be The End of Persecution of Julian Assange. With that said, Chip's currently is working on a book that will be coming out soon that I look forward to with a great anticipation, The Imperial Bureau from Verso Books. Based heavily on the archival research and documents obtained for Freedom of Information Acts, it documents the history of the FBI's political surveillance and explores its larger roles in the national security thing. There we are. With that in mind, I would like to provide each panelist an opportunity to give us a 5-minute assessment right now of this 5th anniversary. I would like to call on Stefania first. Stefania, you have the floor.
Yes, let me tell you that if Julian deserved to stay in prison, he has remained in prison, confined in an embassy, under house arrest, now in Belmarsh, which is the toughest prison in Britain. Well, I deserve the same. Let me be so open about this, because if he deserves it, I deserve the same treatment, because I have published the very same documentation and I have revealed scandals, pressures, human rights abuses only thanks to these documents. And so I feel really uncomfortable. I feel really, in a sense, guilty that I'm here free, whereas he has never again known freedom for the last 15 years. It is a scandal, absolute scandal. I have no other words to. And let me tell you, it was so sad when we were visiting him inside the embassy, and we could witness how his health was collapsing. It was basically collapsing, and we could do nothing. We were reporting on it, we were denouncing it, and nothing was happening. Now he's in Belmarsh. He has been there since April 2019. And this is also a scandal, a huge scandal. It would have been impossible, even in a country like Italy, which is prone to all sorts of judicial, legal scandals. It would be impossible to keep in prison a person without trial for 5 years, and it would not be possible. Simply, it would be impossible. So let me tell you that if Julian get extradited, and it will really be devastating, not just for us, not just for him as a human being, not just for his family, for his wife, his brother and kids, but for all of us. It means that the U.S. authorities, it means that our governments can just put you in prison for life for revealing war crimes, for revealing state criminality at the highest level. And if you don't have the right to know state criminality at the highest level, you cannot say you live in a democracy. In a democracy, it must be possible to reveal war crimes at the highest level, you revealing torture, revealing extrajudicial killings, and the difference between dictatorships and democracies precisely this right to know. So this is a case which will be devastating for journalism, but it will be devastating for all ordinary people unless we have a chance to know what our governments are doing with our money and in our name, and unless we can free Julian and we can stop his extradition, the consequences will be devastating. And it is really important to use this anniversary to make people realize how crucial that they wake up, take to the street, and oppose this monstrous injustice.
Thank you very much, Stefania. Chris, would you please take the floor?
I would just follow up on what Stefania has said, and that is the judicial farce that has characterized the persecution of Julian from the inception. I sat in, was just in London for the 2-day hearing, but attended several of the other hearings, followed them online. And I think that's the only way you can understand the utter perversion of the UK judicial system, and I would add the American judicial system, the deforming of that system to essentially justify a show trial. We can tick off many aspects that should have seen the entire judicial process aborted from the beginning. Of course, he's a publisher, he didn't commit a crime. Unlike Daniel Ellsberg, he did not actually obtain the documents from a security source. Ellsberg had signed an agreement to abide by the secrecy pact that you have to when you work internally. He was working for the Rand Corporation. Julian did none of that. It was a very traditional process. I published classified material when I worked for the New York Times. That material was leaked to me. It was leaked to me in paper. It was leaked to Julian digitally, but there was no difference. The fact that UC Global, the Spanish security firm, videotaped and made audio recordings of every interaction while Julian, for the 7 years he was seeking refuge in the embassy, including with his attorneys, eviscerating attorney-client privilege, alone should have seen the case thrown out. The fact that he is an Australian citizen, so he's not subject to the Espionage Act, that WikiLeaks is not a US-based publication, that he was granted political asylum. The only reason he stayed in the embassy is because the UK would not grant Julian safe passage from the embassy to the airport. I mean, on and on and on. And then, of course, Lenin Moreno, who gets a gigantic, not accidentally, IMF loan of $10 billion, revokes Julian's citizenship. Theresa May allows the Metropolitan Police to go into the embassy, sovereign territory of Ecuador, and seize them. I mean, it's endless. And that's what always throws me. And I think that's one of the reasons they've made it very hard to cover. Audio, when we have to go to audio, often it doesn't work. The seating is ridiculously limited. I mean, even this time, I only got in because activists will get up at 5 in the morning and stand in a line and save me, Craig Murray, and a few other people a place. And I think that's because, of course, the UK courts don't want it. And those people in the overflow room, even in these hearings, these last hearings, the audio wouldn't work. They didn't allow links to go even to Scotland. It wouldn't go outside the UK. I mean, so it's in the details that you confirm everything Stefania just said. That this is classic political persecution of a person who not only did not commit a crime, but is the most courageous and important journalist, publisher of our generation. And that's why so many of us are so outraged. I mean, just to close, if he is extradited and hopefully there are reports of a potential plea, him pleading out on a misdemeanor charge. And let's hope that this is all correct. Thank God that Australia, it's taken them long enough, has finally stood up. But if he was extradited, and the lawyers in the New York Times finally went to the management of the New York Times and said, this is absolutely going to crush your ability to shine a lens into the inner workings of power. If Julian is extradited, it sets a legal precedent. Just to obtain or possess classified documents will be a criminal offense, much less publishing them. So all the way around, and I think I would just say that the smear campaign that was carried out against Julian, unfortunately, was very effective. Obviously, everybody here, Nathan Fuller, Stefania, Chip, everyone, we all stood by him, but a lot of people peeled away when they shouldn't have. And so I just want to laud all of you for, consistently doing the right thing.
Thank you, Chris. Abby, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much for inviting me on this important panel to mark this grim and pretty significant milestone in the case against Assange. And, as the war in Gaza rages on with full U.S. backing, I think it's important to take stock on the ways that journalism has been criminalized and attacked, over 100 media professionals and journalists being killed by Israeli forces in the last 6 months. And I think we're reminded of how little sanctity there is for the profession in Palestine. But as we know, there's many ways to assassinate a journalist. And in places like the West, in the US, and the UK, journalism that doesn't kowtow to power and that runs contrary to state narratives is ridiculed, diminished, and in the case of Julian Assange, criminalized to the fullest extent of the law. So here we are, 5 years where Assange is behind bars, 5 years of denying his freedom, 5 years of the West lecturing to its citizens that locking up this man and depriving him of life, that it's all necessary and just, that what he did was traitorous, treasonous, and that he must pay dearly with his freedom away from his children, And all of it are just lies that take away it just takes away from the brutality of the reality and the dangerous precedent that this case sets for our country. Assange embarrassed the most powerful people in the world, and in turn, they robbed him of his life, his reputation, and his freedom. And when you run the world's most powerful military machine that history has ever known, you do not let people embarrass you without consequences. And, as Chris and Stefania just pointed out, Assange has done more with WikiLeaks than any other journalism outfit has done combined to expose the depth of corruption and crimes of the American empire. So 5 years on, here we are on the eve of a potential extradition to the United States, the heart of the empire, where authorities can throw Assange in a dungeon that he will surely die in. But on this dark day, there's also hope. Biden announcing that he's considering Australia's request to end the decade-long attempt to prosecute Assange. Look, there's a reason that Obama didn't carry out the prosecution, because they know that he's not guilty of what they're saying that he's guilty of, right? If the US government actually believed that Assange was guilty, they wouldn't even be entertaining this as a possibility. Chelsea Manning's sentence was commuted because of the movement behind her. Look, it's been such a long haul. This has been a decade. As Chris said, all of the steadfast, committed defenders of Assange, there's been ebbs and flows. It's been at times exhausting and demoralizing, and it feels helpless, right? And hopeless. But for the last decade, tens of thousands of people have kept this movement alive. We can force the right thing to happen again, because the time to build this pressure is now. The fact that Biden has hinted that he is considering this, that means that we need to galvanize more than ever around this historic moment. We must not give up, because as Stefania said, this is the scandal of the century. The case against Assange shreds the First Amendment that we all claim to cherish, right? That's the foundation of this democracy. And if Assange is extradited to the US and thrown in prison, and the history books close the chapter on this case, it will be the death knell of our democracy.
Thank you, Abby. Thank you very much. Chip, you have the floor.
Yeah, I mean, 5 years of since the arrest of Julian Assange is an incredibly grim milestone, as everyone has pointed out. It's 5 years of a human being persecuted for revealing the truth. And I would note that Julian Assange's persecution did not start with the arrest. He was in the embassy because the US, the UK, and Sweden trapped him there. We know from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, he was subjected to psychological torture. We know from the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, he was a victim of arbitrary detention under international law. So for 14 years now, since the collateral murder video was released, Julian Assange has faced significant deprivations of basic human rights again and again. And the legal warfare, as opposed to the extra legal warfare where they spy on him, they plot to kill him, they plot to kidnap him, is just the latest chapter in this larger war on WikiLeaks. It's an incredibly dark chapter, first and foremost. Like I said, this is about persecuting a human being. I share Abby's concerns that if Julian Assange is brought to this country, he will die here. His health is not in good shape. He suffered a mini stroke. He's broken his ribs due to coughing. It's also about the death of not just the First Amendment, but press freedom globally. The case against Julian Assange really rest on a couple things. First, they brought charges against him under the espionage for pure publishing. They don't allege conspiracy with Chelsea Manning. They don't allege solicitation. They don't allege hacking. They allege he put things on the internet. That is a pure act of publishing. If that charge is, if he's convicted of that and courts uphold that, that will criminalize the New York Times and national security reporting writ large. The way they try to get around a lot of this is they often say, and Chris and Stefani and I heard this when we were in London during the last hearing, is that Julian Assange somehow solicited Chelsea Manning, or he somehow solicited hackers. And you listen and said, okay, that sounds kind of bad. But when I was listening to the case in the London courtroom, and I was in the press annex where they didn't want us to hear anything, so it was very hard to hear and see, and everything else, so much of the solicitation argument was basically WikiLeaks existed. WikiLeaks is a website that publishes information about people who don't want the information published, because as we all know, investigative journalists always get the permission of the person they're investigating. And because this website exists, because there are journalists who say, we will publish information in the public interest if people give it to us, they are soliciting people to, quote unquote, steal national defense information. They kept describing Chelsea Manning as having stolen national defense information, as though she took the only copy of the Afghan war logs and carted them out the door, as opposed to gave public access to a incredibly important document, or that if other people obtain it through illegal means, that WikiLeaks is somehow responsible for this. So not only are they trying to set a precedent that would be the death knell of national security journalism, where publishing itself is a crime, they are equating bold journalism with criminal conspiracy. The conspiracy that WikiLeaks is accused of is a conspiracy to commit journalism. And one of the things about WikiLeaks' sort of rise on the scene is that it came at a time when so many people were so frustrated with the way the corporate media got the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan wrong. They repeated all of the lies in the run-up to the wars. They downplayed the civilian casualties. New York Times sat on the James Risen story about NSA surveillance for over a year and only published it because he was going to put it in his book. So you have this massive failure of the media as a watchdog during the war on terror, when it was probably needed the most. And WikiLeaks pops up, and they're not afraid to defy corporations. They're not afraid to defy the US government. I mean, there was a time where if you were a government, any government, a corporation, a bank, a trade deal, and you were involved in bad conduct, WikiLeaks would publish about it. You know, that was the way it was. It isn't just the Manning revelations. Their history of publishing is phenomenal. And it was such a breath of fresh air compared to what we had lived through during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. And they showed us the truth of those wars. Many of us were aware of what was going on. I remember seeing Chris Hedges talk about his book, Collateral Damage, at the old Brecht Forum. I don't know if you remember that event, Chris, but I saw you speak. I remember seeing the Winter Soldier hearings. I remember sitting with Ethan McCord, the veteran from the Collateral Murder video, talking about his experience. And it was such a important act of journalism to expose the reality of wars and the reality of U.S. foreign policy. And I will end by noting that we are once again living through the media repeating those same mistakes again. We have a media that has not been critical about Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, that has allowed sort of treating the pronouncements of Israeli military officials as objective, while treating anything the Palestinians say as lies until proven otherwise. I think we've had, as people put on Twitter, new advances in passive voice. Blast kills people in Gaza. You know, blast are always killing people. Who's doing the blasting? And we have record levels of dissent in the government right now, not seen since the Iraq War, maybe not seen since the Vietnam War. And when we have public employees who are concerned, when we have governments that are lying, and when we have journalists who want to expose the truth, what message does carrying on this persecution of Assange send to them right now at a time when we need critical journalism the most in the face of a genocidal war in Gaza?
Thank you so very much, Chip. That was incredible. I'd like to mention two things about WikiLeaks. First and foremost, WikiLeaks format changed the concept of journalism as we know it. It created an opportunity for whistleblowers around the world to provide documents, and all journalistic operations use his format today. Second thing is, WikiLeaks in its entire lifespan has never had to issue a retraction or issue an apology. I know of no newspaper of note that can make that claim. However, we have several questions here that I'd like to get to. Now, we've talked about Julian Assange's prosecution and how it matters for the future of journalism. But let's also talk about WikiLeaks revelations. All the charges against Assange pertain to information given to WikiLeaks by whistleblower Chelsea Manning. What was the significance of those revelations? And I know you worked very, very closely on them, Stefania. So I'd like to reach out to you first.
Yes, Vincent, thank you. So I think it's not an exaggeration to say that these are among the most important revelations in the history of journalism. The documents about collateral murder, the collateral murder video, the documents about the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. I was there. I still remember how exciting when we got these documents for the first time since the Pentagon Papers 39 years before. We could see what the propaganda machine was telling us about these wars and what was happening on the war theater, and we could compare what they were telling us and what was happening on the war theater according to the US soldiers. So we could discover secret units, secret special forces, and never surfaced before, like the Task Force 373. This was special task force assigned to kill Taliban leadership. And they had no idea who they were killing. They were killing randomly in the night. They were killing children when they thought they were actually Taliban leaders. They were killing Afghan police forces. And so there was a lot of resentment from the local population about these killings with no idea who they were killing. We could discover the secret war by drones. We could discover civilian deaths never accounted before. It was amazing for we journalists who had to fight every day to get this kind of information, which is completely shrouded in secrecy, and you have no chance to get access to this kind of information because the FOI requests go nowhere. Whistleblowers are so rare. So for us, it was really amazing. Let me let me give you some example of what we discovered thanks to the cables, for example. For the cables were amazing. The cables are still amazing. I keep consulting, researching the cables. I have a new scandal or a name coming out, and let me look what the cables reveal about this guy. Well, let me look whether I can find in these cables. So, for example, the cables allowed us to get the documentation about the political pressure, diplomatic pressures on prosecutors investigating on the CIA renditions. Let me tell you, I'm very proud because my country was the only one to basically to identify the 26 Americans, almost all of them CIA agents, and to put them on trial, to basically to charge them, put them on trial in absentia, because they, of course, had left Italy, and to get a final sentence. We were the only country in the world to do this. Our prosecutors were so brilliant that they were the only one in the world. However, none of them ended up in prison. None of them spent a single day in prison. Well, of course, we could imagine why. We could imagine this pressure, this political intervention, diplomatic interference, and so on. But it is one thing to imagine, it is another thing to have evidence. And we got evidence. We got the full conversations, not with our prosecutors, because they realized, the US authorities realized that they had no chance to get our prosecutors basically stopping their investigation and to have our judges to stop the trials and so on. But they put pressure on the Italian politicians, even both from the left and from the right. And so we have the conversations with our justice ministers, with our conservative leaders, with our current president of the Italian Senate. We had this evidence of how they put pressure on these politicians, both progressive and conservatives. And at the end of the day, none of them went to prison. So there is no way to get this information with, FOI requests. Maybe you get this kind of information after 40 years, after 50 years. But at that point, who cares about these facts? Just professional historians. That's the value of WikiLeaks. You have crucial information when it is most important for citizens to take informed decisions, not after 50 years, not after 60 years when no one cares about the war in Afghanistan, no one cares about the war in Iraq, no one cares about the CIA rendition because they are too far away. To have a democracy, you need to have an informed citizenship. And this secrecy, basically, is not allowing us to understand what is going on. And this secrecy is totally abused. These are not legitimate secrets. These are secrets about state criminalities. It is an abuse of state secrecy. These are not legitimate secrecy. They were using secrecy to cover up war crimes. They were using secrecy to cover up torture. They were using secrecy to cover up extremely serious abuses, human rights abuses with extrajudicial killings by drones. So they were using secrecy to cover up state criminalities. And there is no way to challenge this secrecy. You can do whatever you can. I have been fighting. I have been engaged in a trench warfare, as you said, since 2015, using FOI requests, litigating, getting some of the best FOI lawyers. You can do whatever you want. You can spend hundreds of thousands of euros and dollars to try to get this information. There is no way unless someone from the inside, the whistleblowers, provide this information to you, to a journalist. And you have to realize one important thing. It is not enough to have a courageous source. You need the courage of the source, and you need the courage of the journalist. Because without that, when I hear people saying, well, the hero was Manning, of course, Manning he's a hero, no doubt about this. But without a courageous journalist like Julian Assange, the WikiLeaks journalist, these documents would have never surfaced. So it is not enough to have a courageous source. You also need courageous journalists. And this is why I think the US authorities absolutely want to kill Julian, want to smash Julian. They want that the next Chelsea Manning, who has the next collateral murder video, and the next Julian Assange, who get the next collateral murder video from the next Chelsea Manning, are terrified about leaking it and about publishing it. And they will think twice. And they will say, I don't want to end up like Manning did or like Julian Assange did. So they are in a mission to terrify all of us, not just we journalists, but also the sources, most of all, the sources.
Thank you, Stefania. Chris, could you talk about what the revelations that Assange made mean for the rest of us as well?
Well, Stefania is right, of course, to stress volume. So I broke stories, Stefania has broken stories, but these are incremental stories, tiny pieces of a big whole that most people don't see. And that's what made what happened with the Iraq war logs so unique. It was massive in terms of our ability to understand the inner workings of U.S. empire, the crimes, the lies, just little things that would have made the front page of the New York Times. For instance, the numbers of people, families killed approaching U.S. checkpoints. That was all hidden. Torture. I mean, it's endless. So it's the volume. And Stefania is again right in calling this arguably the most important journalistic series of journalistic revelations maybe ever. I mean, certainly in our lifetime. And we have to, as courageous as Daniel Ellsberg was, it dwarfs even the Pentagon Papers. So in terms of volume, that's key. And just to echo Stefania again, having covered many conflicts, for instance, I covered the war in El Salvador for 5 years. It's only years later that we find out vital information about what happened. As relentless as we were as reporters, so much is covered up, so much is hidden. And that, again, in real time, we were given this body of information, which is important because then you can make judgments about what's happening because you have the truth. I would just add that the real engine behind Julian, the drive to extradite Julian, doesn't in fact come from the release of the Iraq war logs. It comes from the release of Vault 7. Vault 7 was exposed the CIA hacking tools into our televisions, cars, smartphones, everything else, and it doesn't matter if you turn it off. It's still a recording and tracking device. And that really angered the intelligence community. That's when Pompeo discussed assassinating, kidnapping Julian. They called him a hostile, what was the term, Stefania?
Intelligence agency.
Hostile intelligence agency or something.
State intelligence agency.
Right. So that's the impetus behind this. And we should be clear that he's not been charged. This is not part of the extradition request. But there's no question that if he was extradited, it would instantly become part of the extradition request. And that's quite ominous. When you have the CIA essentially calling for your lynching, you're in very serious trouble. So I cannot second all the points Stefania made enough in terms of the importance of what Julian did, what WikiLeaks did, but I also want to stress how dangerous it is because let's be clear, what is the job of the CIA? The CIA is doesn't actually do much intelligence gathering. It's largely a paramilitary operation with its own death squads and special forces teams and drone program and everything else. That's what. So when they discuss assassinating and kidnapping Julian, we should be clear that's not fantasy. That's what they do on a daily basis around the world. Yes, I again will second Stefania's point about Julian's courage, tremendous courage, and the forces that he took on, and the forces that are actively trying to get him, which actually are far more ominous than the Pentagon or the State Department, but actually involve the intelligence community itself.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much. You know, I have to mention something here. I'm going to break for protocol before we do Chip and Abby on this, because we are honored to have as a guest here one of those courageous individuals we were just talking about, who sacrificed pretty much everything to share with the world war crimes of America. And that would be the whistleblower, Daniel Hale. So I would like, because unlike the rest of us, we haven't sat in jail. Now I know that Chris and all of our other journalists have suffered greatly for their principle. Daniel went to jail. So Daniel, would you like to please say a few words about the case here on the 5th anniversary of Julian's incarceration? Please. Okay.
Daniel? He's not sure his mic is working. Give him 2 minutes.
Hang on 1 second. There we go. I'll see if you can get your...
Thanks, Vinny.
Ah, terrific. Fantastic. Go ahead. Fortunately, it looks like we're not getting audio. Tell you what, Daniel, why don't you work on your audio and see if you can get it going? And I would like to pose a question actually right now to Abby. The U.S. is clearly putting Assange on trial for exposing crimes of the U.S. war on terror. What is the relevance to the situations in both Gaza and Ukraine, to name only 2 of the WikiLeaks revelations?
Yeah, I mean, it's such an important point, especially with the context of the genocide going on in Gaza, because, you know, having studied the conflict for the last 15 years, I'm realizing, you know, as I unpack kind of the foundation and the history, that how much WikiLeaks has been integral to my understanding and just the collective understanding of Israel's policies, especially when we look at the Gaza Strip. I mean, you know, doing the documentary Gaza Fights for Freedom and really depending and relying on WikiLeaks cables to elucidate the control, the siege, the policy of, you know, putting Gaza's economy on the brink of collapse. It was actually a deliberate policy that was laid out in these internal cables that we would never know about. And so it's just incredible, like, whether I'm looking at the fossil fuel lobbyists and the control of oil dominance around the world, whether I'm looking at Palestine, whether I'm looking at Ukraine, whether I'm looking at Iraq, WikiLeaks has always been so crucial to my understanding of U.S. foreign policy. And it's actually really scary to think of a world without WikiLeaks, and putting that fear in the heart of journalists and publishers that this too could happen to you. And in fact, it will. And that's exactly what this case is all about. And, you know, and also just why does Hamas exist? Who was behind the rise of Hamas? I mean, that's another WikiLeaks cable that was revealed, that Israel actually helped Hamas gain power because they didn't want Fatah or the Palestinian Authority to have power in Gaza, because they wanted to deem Gaza as a hostile entity so they could just impose collective punishment on the 2.3 million people living there. And so that's always been articulated behind the scenes, but never quite revealed until WikiLeaks cables laid that bare. I mean, there's so many more when it comes to what's going on. I think what's really just damning is looking, the fact that WikiLeaks and Chelsea Manning and the revelations really helped bring an end to the Iraq War. And we're looking at some of the things that Chris and Stefania talked about. I mean, it's shocking when you look at things like the Haditha massacre, the Blackwater operatives, hundreds of thousands of mercenaries that were on the ground in Iraq, opening fire, killing scores of civilians. None of these things would be known about, I mean, until potentially decades later. All of these things were hidden. The US certainly wasn't going to come out and say what was happening on the ground. And remember, at a time, even though there was an anti-war movement in the streets against Iraq, at the time, I mean, there was such unquestioning patriotism and this nationalistic fervor in a post 9/11 world that segued over to the Iraq invasion that for the most part, Americans were completely in the dark and did not know the breadth and scope of the crimes that were being committed. So all of this coming out really did help the masses awaken and see the crimes against humanity that were being committed in Iraq, and in turn did help end the Iraq War. And when you look at Israel today and the flagrant war crimes that are being committed in our names, essentially, because it's all being subsidized and backed by the Biden administration. But I mean, there's Haditha massacres going on every single day. And the only reason that we're knowing about this real time is because Palestinians are able to show us on social media and live stream their reality. But Iraqis never had that capacity. WikiLeaks was the conduit to show the world and to expose for the masses those crimes at that time. And so the parallel is kind of like, it's kind of disturbing to see how much more is being done, and just being able to dictate to us real time. I just keep thinking, what would Assange say? I miss his analysis so much, and I miss his intellect at this moment in time. It's so crucial. I just wish that he was free and with his family and being able to help us expose Israel's heinous atrocities.
Thank you, Abby. It seems that Daniel has gotten his audio in order. So, Daniel, you have the floor. Please tell us what you can.
Hey, so can you hear me now?
I can hear you perfectly, and you look terrific.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. So, this picture of my deceased cat is the only thing you're going to get from me today. Rest in peace. So, I don't know. I didn't expect to say anything today, so I wasn't really prepared. But what do I say about Julian Assange's case? It hasn't been said yet. I'm reluctant to say that I feel a kinship to Assange in a way, but there are, maybe a handful of people who can relate to what it's like to be under the pressure of a trial by the Espionage Act. Understandably, Assange faces a much greater degree of scrutiny than your average whistleblower does. And we take a big step back. In 2010, when I first learned about WikiLeaks, it was because I was in an Air Force classroom preparing for a cryptologic linguist position in the NSA, and my commissioned officer came into the classroom one day to inform me and all the classmates that under no circumstances were we to go to WikiLeaks or search anything about WikiLeaks on the internet should it jeopardize our security clearance if we were caught doing so. And that moment really in time really stands out to me, because that's I became so much more curious about what WikiLeaks was doing and what it was. I had to know, and so I almost immediately broke the rules and went searching. And it's just been said over and over again, but we are so much more how do I say it? We are so much more gifted and blessed with the power of knowledge and the evidence to point to the just the abject crimes in outlandish behavior of the empire because of an organization like WikiLeaks. And today, like Abby was saying, today now more than ever, we need WikiLeaks. We need Julian Assange. We need more Julian Assanges now more than ever because WikiLeaks laid the groundwork. It set the standard, and that standard has been chipped away by the United States government ever since. And as much as it would be a thrill to see Assange free, I cannot deny that there is a inkling fear in the back of my mind that he will never live as a free man inside or outside of prison. And there is nowhere on this earth that he could go that he would be safe from the empire. The worst case scenario, should Assange be extradited to the United States, tried and convicted and sentenced to prison, in the federal prison system, as much of my life was upended by the pursuit of the government after me for my attempt to blow the whistle on the United States drone program. As Julian Assange's experience in that system would be 10 times as worse. He would almost certainly spend the rest of his life in prison. Even with I would venture to say that he would absolutely be put on special access measures, which essentially is a form of burying a person alive by cutting them off with all contact with the outside world. If he was ever brought to a communications management unit like the one that I was sent to, he would never be allowed to touch or hug or kiss his wife or kids again, because all contact with them would be completely cut off. He would not be allowed to have any physical contact with them whatsoever. He would only be restricted and allowed to 2 short 4-hour visits per month behind a plexiglass screen, speaking over a telephone in a rather dim and drab and unair conditioned boxed in room. He would be subject to a decades long prison sentence in an environment with other men who have been beaten down and destroyed by our carceral state, men who, their crimes aside from the fact, men who have been literally tortured in places like Florence ADX, made to serve more than a decade in solitary confinement. Many of them men who have had to go on hunger strike during the times in ADX just for the sake of being able to write their own family members. It is a cruel and sadistic legal system that we have set up here, and it is a sad fact that the same prosecutors who came after me, who came after Jeffrey Sterling, they want to come after Julian Assange because, let's face it, they have a hard-on for people who try to shine a light on their bullshit, and that these are sick, fucked up people who think that that the United States has a right to kill and take whatever it wants just because it is the biggest country in the world. It isn't exaggeration to call these people fascists. These are also Zionist, so that should tell you all you need to know about them too. But anyways, Assange, I didn't spend a decade locked up in an embassy, and I only spent 3 years in prison versus Assange's now going on 5 years. but every step of the way that I spent, from the moment that I decided to walk out of the National Geospatial Agency with a stack full of classified information underneath my shirt, I spent a life in fear and in paranoia. And I came to the brink of wanting to end my own life more than once, every step along the way. And it's took the government 5 years to decide that they wanted to get around to prosecuting me. I think it was like 2 months after Julian was kidnapped out of the embassy that that I was arrested, and spent another 2.5 years on pretrial conditions, much of it during COVID. The the decision I made cost me it cost me a great deal of money, a great deal of loss of income. It's almost, it cut me off from much of my family and my friends for years because the fear of what any person who might, any person close to me might be used to testify against me, was so great that I just simply disappeared for the sake of, my own safety and theirs. And, it's ironically in the end, the least depressed that I was for this entire saga was probably my time during prison. And a lot of that I owe to many of you and everyone else who has been there for me every step of the way and reached out to and expressed their solidarity. And you don't have any idea how much that means to me. It was dreadful the time that I was in prison and I was unable to communicate with many of my friends, my family. Chris was so kind as to come visit me, but I couldn't bear the thought of asking him to come visit me more than once because it is just seriously depressing to get a visitor and then not be able to even shake hands or hug them, and to only have to spend such a short period of time and then return to an environment where you are locked up with men who are most all of whom are in desperate need of mental health care and just general health care in general, but are receiving none, who have no purpose left, who are completely and totally cut off from their families, and that they just really exist as a husk and a whole of a human being. And that is for many of them, that's something that they've gone on for decades. They've had to live under. Where I was at, I was locked up with a lot of young men and not so young men who were products of the so-called war on terror, and that many of them were, young kids who got caught up saying something on the internet or to an informant, and then now they are facing 20 to 25 years in prison, and none of that did them any good. And it is a sad fact that if anything, it reinforced a worldview in their minds that that they assume that they become the thing that the United States government accused them of, wanting to be a terrorist, wanting to attack and hurt people just for the sake of hurting them. And had the United States heeded the warnings and the obviously the very clear minded sighted people, the prophets of our time, people like Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning and etc. The United States would not be in such a desperate position as today. But it is it's the what Julian is going through. It is terrible. It is awful, but it is the price to pay for having a conscience in this world, sadly. I wish I had encouraging words to end on, but I have to get to Baltimore because there is no federal halfway house in the capital of the United States of America. So I have to go take a 2-hour trip to see my case manager. I still on house arrest for the next 3 months, and then I will be on probation for 3 years after that.
Daniel,
But
thank you so very, very much. I not just for speaking today, I know it's difficult for you, but also for the courage. Most of us think, "Oh, I know what to do." If we are called to stand on our principle, we know what you chose to do, and we also know the value of the assurances made by the United States government, because you were provided assurances that you would not be where you ended up. And of course, Julian faces the very same thing. So thank you for your courage. Thank you for your speaking out here. And thank you for providing the truth to the American people about the crimes that are committed in our name and our tax dollars. We owe you a debt of gratitude we can never repay.
yeah, thank you, man. I really genuinely appreciate that. If I could say one last thing about
Please
just about
do.
the parameters of what a Julian process, because right now today we're talking about the good news that I guess was the press secretary said made some comment, offhanded comment. You know, I'm very highly skeptical about whether Biden's going to make any decision about this pardoning Assange, particularly before this election. Quite frankly, I just don't see it happening, period. Sorry to be so pessimistic. But you know, we have to be prepared for the worst, and it seems more likely than not that the worst is coming. Um, you know, it is without us, it is an absolute certainty that should Julian Assange be brought before a jury, that he would be totally denied any effort, any right to uphold a defense. And you know, as it was my case, and as in every Espionage Act case, there is defendants are not permitted to make any case before a jury that is anything other than basically that. But you cannot on the one hand say that yes, I committed the crime, but I did so for a specific reason, because the moment that you would do the moment that you do, you essentially admit guilt and the trial is over, and the judge would be forced to instruct a jury to find you guilty because of the way the law is written. And I'm sure most of you are aware of this. The key difference between Assange and every other Espionage Act case, it is that Julian Assange is a foreign national who has never held a security clearance. And one of the key ways that they secure convictions in these Espionage Act cases is that they simply go to the stack of non-disclosure agreements all clearance holders are forced to sign if they wish to keep a job. And they point to this and say, you signed here that you knew that it was wrong, that it was illegal to do what you did, and yet you did so anyways. They have no argument against Assange, and because Assange, never having held a security clearance, never having only ever visited this country once, to my knowledge, could in no way have known that there would be any consequences or supposed theoretical harm to the United States should certain information be released to the public or certain information divulged to an authority not entitled to receive it. I think on that basis, more than anything else, more than his even being a journalist, would probably be his best and only shot at getting an acquittal, because I just don't know how the government would prove that that Assange in his own mind knew the information that he was publishing could cause harm to the United States, as is written in the law. Outside of that, it's like I said, these escapes, they've even now touched and reached the president of the United States. And even though that they're going to treat presidents and ex-presidents and any other high-ranking government officials with complete and total deference as opposed to everyone else, it's there that it's where it's if anything, in this court alone, and ironically speaking, by trying Julian in the Eastern District of Virginia because of the precedents that have now been set with the Petraeus case and the Sterling case. For those of you who don't know, David Petraeus was caught lying to the FBI about the documents that he was sharing with his mistress, and that would have gotten him an Espionage Act charge in any other, if he were any other person. But since the DOJ couldn't just look the other way, they had to charge him with obstruction of justice. And yet they didn't want to set a precedent by sentencing him in the Eastern District of Virginia. So the DOJ quietly allowed them to change the venue to North Carolina and reduced it from a felony to a misdemeanor. It was only due to the grace of God and the fact that David Petraeus was such a screw up that Jeffrey Sterling, who many of you probably know as the CIA whistleblower, he was only sentenced to 3 years as opposed to 20. And in this court, I was sentenced to 45 months, just a slightly higher sentence than Assange. But if any at sentencing and at any potential sentencing, I would hope that the judges who would be receptive to this argument, that the amount of time that Assange has spent in exile and in the extradition process, on top of any potential time that he would receive for convictions under the Espionage Act, would hopefully be taken consideration, and that in a worst case scenario, should he be sentenced to prison, that it would not be several decades, but could potentially be shy of a decade. I don't know. I don't like to think about these things, but I feel like at the same time you have to be somewhat grounded in
Hope
just
for the
the
best,
facts of the way.
prepare for the worst.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Sorry. I've got to get ready to go, and I'm
Daniel,
so sorry for
thank
taking
you
up all
so
the space
very,
here.
very much. Thank you.
Yeah,
so
thank
very,
you, and
very
thank you to
much.
everyone else here. Abby, Chris, Stefani, and Stefania. I'm sorry, and Chip. Good to see you guys.
Be well, my friend. Chip, I'd actually like to go off script here. And since we had Daniel speaking, I'd like you to address the issue of assurances from the United States government that are currently being requested by the extradition judges in London, if you would please.
Sure. So in February of this year, Chris Stefani and I were in a London courtroom because they were having what was technically a hearing about whether or not Julian Assange could appeal. Not even an actual appeal hearing, but a hearing about whether or not he could appeal. The Assange defense requested 9 different grounds to appeal on. This is the first time in 4 years the legal arguments have turned on issues of political expressions, the political offenders exception under international law, as well as just basic questions of journalism. At the initial hearing, the judge rejected the free expression arguments and ruled based on the prison conditions and Julian Assange's mental health. So we've been in this sort of interest, which are very important. I don't want to diminish them, but we've been in this sort of interesting situation where we've had the press freedom case of the century, and we've been having all these hearings about whether or not this psychiatrist's evidence was given too much weight or not. And this was the first time where the press freedom arguments since the initial hearing were back in play. The 2 court judges who heard the case issued a very dismal ruling, in my opinion. It is 66 pages, and it denies most of the Assange avenues for appeal. There is a section of analysis on Article 10 of the European Human Rights Covenant, which is similar to the First Amendment. I think it's less protective, but it's similar, under which they argued that prosecuting Julian Assange for the Chelsea Manning revelations would not violate his free expression rights. They said only 3 of the charges against him had anything to do with free expression. The rest were ordinary crimes, And I don't know how receiving national defense information when you're a journalist that you publish is an ordinary crime with no nexus to free expression, but that's fine. And then for the 3 remaining charges, which were the pure publishing charges, publishing the Afghan war logs, the Iraq war logs, and the State Department cables, they ruled there was no free expression interest or public interest in publishing them because they contained the names of informants. And there's a lot to go in about how WikiLeaks actually tried to redact the names of informants, but we're already 12 minutes over. I won't go down that road. So it's a mostly very dismal decision, but they did allow Assange 3 avenues to appeal. One of the avenues of appeal has to do with the fact that the U.S. did not give death penalty assurances. Assange is not currently charged with a capital crime, but there is a hypothetical scenario under which he could be. And the UK judges during the hearing really blew their own case by saying the defense is right about this. This could happen and we're powerless to stop it because there is a statutory prohibition in the UK under extraditing someone if they'll face a death penalty. On top of this, Gordon Kromberg did this sworn declaration about what a fair trial Julian Assange would have because he could make rulings before an independent member of the judiciary. Throughout this declaration, Gordon Kromberg imagines what Assange's attorneys will argue. He imagines they'll argue Assange's conduct is covered by the First Amendment, that Assange is being selectively prosecuted, and that under the Fifth Amendment, the Espionage Act is void for vagueness. Why, if you were a federal prosecutor, would you put those things in writing? I have no idea. Gordon Kromberg is a man of great mystery to me. And then he wrote, but we don't believe any of those things are true. Here's the arguments we would lay out. And on the First Amendment one, he laid out a number of arguments, but the one that was problematic was that we could argue Julian Assange as a foreign national doesn't have First Amendment rights. So this sparked a problem because if Julian Assange cannot rely on the First Amendment, he does not have free expression rights, even if we don't think, and this is judges think, this is not me, think prosecuting him doesn't violate that, and he would be subject to disparate treatment as a foreign national. So the US has until April the 16th to provide assurances that it will not seek the death penalty, that Assange will not be prejudiced at any point in his trial as a foreign national, and that he may rely on the First Amendment. The may rely on the First Amendment assurance is a point of great controversy. I have a very cynical, pessimistic interpretation of it. I know other people who are very smart are less pessimistic about it than I am. I hope I'm wrong and they're right. I wrote a very lengthy piece in Jacobin explaining what it means. But my interpretation is that they just cannot argue he lacks First Amendment rights, given that other defendants in Espionage Act cases have challenged the constitutionality of the statute, but they've been defeated. And given that they say the First Amendment is analogous to the European Article 10, and Article 10 would not protect publications. I don't believe they're asking for the U.S. Department of Justice to recognize Assange's press freedom interest in publishing his information. They just have to check off a legal box. And to me, the assurances are really about giving the U.S. a roadmap and what they need to say in order to extradite him. And I'm very disturbed by the most recent ruling from the courts.
Thank you, Chip. And as you pointed out, we are over time here. We can go probably another 15 minutes. So what I would like to do is I would like to call on Abby, please, and make a final statement on your feelings about the case at this point and what we have in the future. Please.
I'll just be quick. I mean, I think everyone really, said a lot of great things. I mean, I still feel like we need to end on an optimistic note just because I feel like we can push the charges to be dropped and the movement can continue to build and force the hand of the presidency. I truly do. And, Biden is certainly a monster. There's no doubt about that. And I think that he's personally overseen this horrific genocidal onslaught. But I think that, the reason that the US doesn't go out and kill journalists in the same way that Israel is doing and has done over and over again in a targeted way that's very clear is because the US does to a certain extent care about its image. Yes, they talked about, Hillary laughed about, can we drone strike this guy? And Trump and Pompeo obviously floated the idea of assassinating Assange, but for the most part, that's not the way that the US prefers to do things. They kind of like to just shut people up and assassinate their character. And that's why we've seen the character assassination against Assange be such a dramatic way that the U.S. has tried to prosecute him in the court of public opinion, and that's why so many people wrongly think that Assange is being persecuted because of the 2016 election or something to do with Trump or the Podesta files. Nothing, it couldn't be further from the truth, but that's the way that they like it. They want to hint at the notion that Assange is some treasonous, villainous character that brought us Donald Trump. But going back to what happened with Chelsea Manning and the fact that Chelsea was the one who was the whistleblower and she is free, and it just points to how absurd and ridiculous the ongoing persecution of Assange is, that he was simply the publisher, the conduit, the avenue to expose these heinous crimes, and he is still going to be the one taking the fall for them. I truly think that, if we push more than ever, we can, now is the time. Now is the time. There's some sliver of chance that Biden hinted to. And even though he's a maniac and a monster and an unabashed Zionist, I mean, there's still a chance. And I'm just so worried, going off of what Daniel said, that if he is extradited, then that's going to be case closed, and he's just going to be, the history book's going to close the chapter, and we're just all going to move on. And we cannot let that happen. We simply cannot let that happen. And so it's been a long haul. It's been a long road, but like I now is the time. This is the moment. This is the moment.
Thank you, Abby. Stefania, I'd like to give you an opportunity to make a final statement, please.
Yes, I absolutely agree with Abby. Now is the moment. We have to do whatever we can to stop his extradition. He has no chance. The moment he leaves Europe, is gone. I have no doubt about this. And so I want to call on people to take to the street, to do whatever they can to write to the member of Congress, to protest, to organize sit-in, lectures, whatever they want, in order to stop his extradition. Let me tell you that the Argentinian Peace Nobel Prize, Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, he lived under the Argentinian dictatorship, and he was a dissident. And of course, the regime arrested him, put him in prison, tortured him, and they were ready to board him on those death flights that the Argentinian dictatorship used against dissidents. And he basically, the only reason why he was not boarded on those death flights is because people mobilized. And so he made an appeal and said, if it worked for me under a regime, it will work for Julian under our democracy, what is left of our democracy. So he called on people to mobilize, to take to the street, to do whatever they can. And I absolutely agree. With this case, we are at crossroads. Let me tell you, I come from a country which basically invented fascism. And the first thing that Mussolini did was to destroy press freedom. One of the very first things he did was to destroy press freedom and to decide who was a legitimate journalist. According to the regime, they were in charge of deciding who was a legitimate journalist doing legitimate journalism. That's why I was terrified when I heard the United States calling Julian Assange not a journalist. You cannot allow the state authorities to decide who is a legitimate journalist. You absolutely have to fight this. You absolutely have to fight against this, because unless we can reveal war crimes, what should we do? I mean, journalism is about revealing state criminality at the highest level. Democracy is about the possibility for the ordinary people to know state crimes. So that's why we absolutely have to win this case, because if we lose this case, our society will go fully, openly authoritarian. This is what is at stake. It is the last call for Julian, and it is the last call for us.
Thank you, Stefania. Well said. And I know, Chris, you have a firm stop here shortly, so I would like to give you the last word before I make some final statements, please.
Well, I was close friends with Michael Ratner, who was Julian's lawyer. That's how I met and spent time with Julian. I would fly to London with Michael. And Michael always said that he couldn't do, he was the head of the Center for Constitutional Rights. He couldn't do his work unless there were people in the street. And there was a moment where Baritza, I was in London, and she started complaining about the noise in the streets filtering into the courtroom. It's absolutely key. They do feel this pressure. I think that there are good reasons why the Biden administration does not want Julian extradited before the elections. The reports of potential plea deal, as far as I know, are real. The details of it I'm not aware of, but reportedly there is talk of allowing Julian to plea out on a misdemeanor. I think the heaviest pressure has come from Australia, finally, with the parliament. It's very, very important. Took a long time to get here. But we've just seen, like I think, and of course, I covered the Middle East for the New York Times. I spent a lot of time in Gaza. These sustained protests against the genocide they've not accomplished what we want them to accomplish, but they're extremely effective in terms of mechanisms of pressure. And we have to put that same kind of pressure on behalf of Julian, because it does work. It doesn't always work, but it is the only thing that will work.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to close by saying I thank all of our panelists, not only for your participation today, but the work you all do on a daily basis to ensure that there is still an opportunity for the truth to be shared with the people. Thank you, Abby, for your unstinting work sharing the plight of Palestinians and many other issues ignored by or suppressed by the mainstream media. Stefania, what can I say about the incredible work you've done alongside WikiLeaks to ensure that the revelations they produced saw the light of day? Once more, I wish to recommend Secret Power, WikiLeaks and Its Enemies. It is an incredible book. If you wish to see how WikiLeaks worked to ensure the veracity of what they publish, how carefully they redacted all of their releases, look no further than this incredible book, which, as I said, I have read twice. What can I say about the courage of the man that I'm looking at, Chris Hedges, that has not been said in the alternative media, but is almost totally ignored by the mainstream media, which at great personal expense he abandoned, or more likely was defenestrated from, to pursue the truth regardless of where it led him. Chris is a writer I always read because he is a front line of each and every cause I believe in, but I wish to make a special recommendation again for War is a Force That Gives It Meaning, as it is too a book I've read many times and reread for its brilliance, clarity, and the cause of our never-ending wars. Lastly, and most importantly, I wish to thank my dear friend Chip Gibbons, whose voice from London, like Chris Stefania, shared with the world what was happening there. Chip, your ability to clarify the arcane legal issues that make up the ongoing prosecution of Julian, understandable to us all, that are lucky enough to read you, in defending rights and dissent, Jacobin, and as I said earlier today, breaking in the nation and the prosecution of Julian Assange. Chip, I must point out, in the last several days, worked tirelessly like a dog to make this webinar a reality. Thank you, Chip, for all you did to make this happen. And I look forward to the Imperial Bureau once it's published. Now, more importantly, to all of our listeners around,
so I can finish the book.
Yes. To all of our listeners around the world, thank you for tuning in. And please go to AssangeDefense.org, StellaAssange.com, and AssangeCampaign.org.eu. Please contribute what you can to our efforts. We are mostly a volunteer operation, operating on a shoestring budget, but more importantly, and this was in the chat, take action wherever you are. All of your congresspersons, you need to call them and tell them to sign House Resolution 934 to end the extradition of Julian. And most importantly, speak out, act out, free Assange. Thank you all so very, very much.